I am Deb Shea. I'm the VP of Strategy and Partnerships at OVH, and I will be introducing our guests today and moderating a little bit. Who in here has heard of OVH before? A few hands. Okay, excellent. Good news.
Thanks for being here.
We appreciate it. So just a quick little introduction of OVH, and then we'll kick off the program with Steve and Mike. So OVH is a global cloud infrastructure provider. We are headquartered in France, and we do some really cool and innovative things different from some of our competition. We are vertically integrated, so that means that we build our servers from scratch. We build our data centers from scratch. We build the racks. And we've created this technology that allows us to liquid cool our servers. So we've really reduced the cost in our data centers by having almost no air conditioning bill. What that means is we're able to pass on to our customers really great value at a great price. We're global. We have 28 data centers worldwide, and we're really excited to be at VMworld this year. So our program today is about BCDR, which is a focus of OVH globally. And so we've worked with 451 Research for a while, and we're excited to have Steven, who is the Senior Analyst of Storage, an expert on BCDR, and then Mike Fincham, who's our Solutions Architect. And the program today, Steven will talk to you for about 20 minutes about best practices and overcoming different challenges that we see in this space. And then we'd really like to open it up and make this interactive and have a Q&A session. So I guess I didn't quite click to Mike's beautiful face, but here he is. So without further ado, Steven, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for showing up. I know coming to a show or program after lunch is always a little challenging, so I'll do the best I can to make sure that we keep you awake because everything just wants to sit and digest instead. Thank you, Deb. Like you said, I've been covering storage, server, and data center technology for about 25 years. Prior to that, I was involved in the Fortune 500, and we had all kinds of interesting things going on there because it was an environment that was based predominantly on mainframe. And to this day, mainframe still has a pretty high spot in the IT data center for banking, for retail, but ultimately there's a ton of other projects and a ton of other applications that are running in all kinds of locations. And I've had a surprisingly and unfortunately large number of experiences in terms of relative disasters or relative business continuity issues. So what I try to do is pull back a little bit because it's too easy to get caught in the minutia of dealing with a specific app and to give you folks just a little bit of what insight I've had over the years in terms of a disaster recovery and business continuity. So rather than going through the agenda, we'll just get to it, shall we? The problem with the disaster recovery, it's really easy to just look at it academically. Here, I put this little thing together because we're going to talk about
disaster recovery.
Now, if you had that kind of a lead-in for any disaster recovery initiative, it would make a lot of sense to more people. Purely because disasters don't happen regularly. I mean, really, we're talking about a world now where there's a lot of redundancy in terms of systems. The cloud has changed everything in terms of being able to protect your data, protect your production environment. But really, we're looking at a situation where there's all kinds of things that impact business continuity, but don't necessarily rise to the level of an actual disaster. And then there's some smaller things that could become a disaster, even though it doesn't involve fire, water, wind, earth, air. It really is about availability of underlying services. So we ran some polling recently about what kind of disasters and what kind of business interruptions customers have had. We found that 3/4 of the businesses that we spoke to had experienced something in the last 5 years. Only a quarter were lucky enough to never have anything go wrong, or it was never enough of something going wrong to be able to initiate a disaster recovery initiative. Have you heard anything in terms of what you're finding from customers as well when you work with companies? Do you find that there's a regular, a relatively high percentage of companies that have issues like this?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. The number one conversation I have as a solution architect with my customers is relative to DR. That's usually where my customers start in their cloud journey. And there's a number of reasons they go there, but cloud can be a very scary thing to take on, but disaster recovery is something every business needs, right?
Yeah.
So from a failure perspective, a lot of times what I'm dealing with is local failures in the building, not so much at a hosting provider.
Right, exactly. Because, the wonderful thing about cloud, and this is why I really think that cloud is an ideal environment for an application like disaster recovery, business continuity, is because it serves all of the needs. If you go back, and I go back way back to the business continuity, disaster recovery was called backup. That's all you had. That's all that was available. If you were a business that needed more than that, you spent a ton of money building out a colo environment that mirrors exactly what you need. To this day, there's still a lot of companies that need to do that purely for governance or compliance issues. But for the most part, we also have an environment where there's all kinds of businesses that suddenly are dependent on IT, but they don't realize the ramifications of protecting that IT appropriately. When we talk about what happens when things go wrong, these are the kinds of answers that we had gotten, whether it was hard losses due to a downtime for an e-commerce project, or it's some kind of downtime based on the unavailability of resources that were an absolute necessity to keep the business running on a day-to-day basis. In my case, back in the 90s, we had a chain of stores, 150 stores that needed to be connected with at all times, because all of those transactions, all of the inventory challenges were all being routed through, at that point, relatively slow connections. Whether it was FM bouncing off of a satellite or whatever, it was a challenge to keep connection with all of those entities, because again, as far as remote resources go, a remote store of 50,000 or 60,000 square feet is a pretty substantial robo environment. So it goes from hard losses to soft losses. Again, how much value can you place on the loss of reputation when you don't have something that's supposed to be there, when you're the service that your customers are expecting to have available and they lose track of it? And I have been through nightmares where, like, for example, 6 months worth of advertising work was lost purely because someone forgot to update a license. And these are things that just show up for any number of reasons. But and I'm a storage guy at heart, because I believe everything begins and ends at storage. So ultimately, data capacity and growth is one of the major issues. But the next one is disaster recovery, business continuity, and then the high cost of storage in general. These are all bundled together, because we have an environment where our data comes from a lot of locations, it gets stored in a lot of locations. And even more importantly, we have the opportunity to use that data in a lot more locations. So we still need to think in terms of triaging what's most important in the context of business continuity and disaster recovery. And ultimately, it was funny when we were talking about the title, if you looked at your program, it was DRBC, and actually you switch it to BCDR because realistically, more of the challenges show up from a business continuity perspective rather than a true disaster. But like I said, that varies. And again, a lot of it is tied directly to storage, because that's the gold. Everybody talks about data being the lifeblood of the enterprise. Well, yeah, it is. I mean, whether it's data that you need or data that keeps your business running or data that you're providing for other people, this is what needs to be protected, all in all. So we're going to talk about a little, again, this is level setting, because I'm sure there's some people here, and if I saw you personally, you could tell in your eyes somebody who's actually been through a major disaster. It's like, oh yeah. But R2 and RP are the two issues that really change the economic model of disaster recovery, business continuity. These are terms that you should know cold. An RTO is really simple, recovery time objective. It means how quick can you get up when things go down. So ultimately, it's a time frame, minutes, hours, days. RPO is how much you potentially stand to lose in between that system outage and what you can restore to. So it might mean that you do backups every day and something fails at 5 o'clock business time. Everything that occurred from that last backup to 5 o'clock p.m. business could potentially be gone. based on your environment. And these are the things that companies use to evaluate the most intelligent model. Is this what you think that, is this what you work with companies on first of all? Is this the big part?
No, absolutely. We were just talking about this in my booth just an hour ago. In the old days, right, if we go back, it was measured in days. And then we started moving into hours. And now with continuous data protection products that are available from a number of vendors, it's measured in seconds, right?
Sure,
and
exactly.
so the conversation for me as a solution architect when I talk to a customer usually starts with, what's your budget look like? Because that drives what we can achieve here, right? Is this a funded project? Do you have the buy-in from your stakeholders across the business, right? And if you've done DR planning, you know that this is a tough discussion because generally people that aren't in IT view this as an insurance policy and they don't like to allocate money. It's not as sexy as production, right? So your money determines how well you can do here. And then the quest becomes, how do I take that money and get the most value out of it across these two metrics?
Which brings up and we're going to talk a little about the anatomy of a DCBR plan, purely because realistically, when I look at any kind of IT issue, like I said before, most challenges are very human challenges. And whether it's being able to accommodate people and the needs of their business, or it's a matter of being able to deal with the frailties of what the human is. Because realistically, humans are my second favorite species after dogs. Dogs are really cool. But I really I know that as nature, and I have been through a number of disasters where things go horribly wrong, and the best laid plans just tend to fall apart. And this is where I think you really need to take the opportunity to do some automation. We'll talk about that downstream. But realistically, part of the challenge is looking at the challenges of making sure that, one, people are safe in the case of a disaster, two, that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and three, they may hopefully not be the cause of the disaster, because that happens too. Sometimes even well-intentioned actions turn into a horrible nightmare, right?
Absolutely.
So ultimately what you're trying to do is provide a safety net for the people that are really the ones that are doing, because we're way smarter than any computer that I know of, and I think it'll be that way for a while. We can do all kinds of abstract thinking that computers just don't do very well. But they can follow rules to the T and execute them incredibly quickly. So once you get past the human factor, communications, people being in the wrong place after things go horribly wrong, it's data protection, that should be ongoing. Backup is still a necessity. Even though we're evolving to a much more dynamic environment where backups may be part of a new software-defined storage environment, you still need to have backups, because ultimately having your data in a separate place is like job one, as far as I'm concerned, from a data protection standpoint. But then you get to the four factors here that are outlined in that blue bar that are issues that IT is generally expected to deal with, which is identifying the applications that are important, which is understanding the infrastructure needs of those applications if they can't be run on your local environment. The next thing is service dependencies, because this is easy to forget. As we talk about this distributed computing environment, you are connected to all kinds of sources of data. Whether, say, for example, there was an outage last year at S3 in the East Coast area, and it took down thousands, tens of thousands of websites that were dependent on images and other things that were hosted on Amazon S3. They didn't worry. Why? Because S3 never goes down. Yes, it does. It went down for 3 hours, but some customers lost days of accessibility to their websites purely because they didn't plan for the ability to fail off that. Now, AWS, I can't blame, because things happen, and they actually have the tools and the services available to protect against that, but people don't want to spend the money, going back to RTO, RPO. And it's like insurance or anything else. You're gambling against the fact that things just won't go wrong. Well, after they've gone wrong a couple times, it changes your opinion pretty dramatically. And so the service dependencies are important. RTO, RPO, that's a hard one to calculate, and it depends on your technical people to be able to help make those decisions, right? Because, and the next slide we'll talk about this a little bit, what expectations are, but the other things that I add, and these are the nice to haves, is policy continuity, whether it's a security policy or something like that. So when you move your data or your production to another location, you need to make sure your policies continue to be followed. You need to have a failback plan, because eventually you theoretically will be able to bring that stuff back on board, and you need to think both directions. Documentation is something that we've always ignored. I mean, face it, I've seen some projects that have gone back 25 years and are so poorly documented that people just don't even want to shut them down for fear that they'll never come back again. So we're talking about obviously some really large applications or old legacy applications, but regardless whether old or new, you need to have a plan to be able to bring those home as necessary. Testing and compliance. And I think this is a really important thing that gets overlooked. No data protection model is really trustworthy until it's been tested. It should be tested regularly because things change. And you may be in an environment where you need to have documentation of that. So here's RTO, and this is something that we asked customers in terms of what were their expectations for RTO, RPO for mission critical, business critical, and non-critical workloads. Now this is, I believe, the same model that you use when you're
That's correct.
identifying.
We did this yesterday, exactly, right? And so the distribution that we talk about is somewhere around 25%, no
Sure.
more than 25% at mission critical.
Right.
Closer to 35 or 40 in the middle.
Right, exactly. And if you look at some of these, and this is something I'm not going to be able to go through in this program, but you can look at this afterwards and wonder what the sanity level was on some of these people's responses, because who wants non-critical data available in less than an hour? I mean, ultimately, that doesn't make any sense, and that's the RTO RPO challenge, right?
Well, and it will drive costs too, right?
Exactly.
Placing that kind of value on non-critical data is going to balloon it to what is essentially an old school high availability DR design, which is just not cost effective in any way.
Yeah, and this is again balancing your end user or your business manager's expectations is really important. To say, look, we can give you X, but it's going to cost you Y, and then all of a sudden it's not that important anymore. So making some of these tiering decisions, some of them are really easy. I mean, if this is your accounting software, or if this is your inventory software, or if this is your any number of applications that are the core business applications, those are obvious. Then you start getting into the grayer area, the supporting applications, the reporting applications. All of these things have relative importance based on your environment, and they're not the same between two companies, not even between two companies in the same business because of the way that you run your business. So this is something you could look at later on. It'll give you a chuckle because really sometimes you just wonder what they're thinking when a customer has expectations that are just unrealistic. This is my favorite quote. I won't, but ultimately, this guy was telling his management how much it costs, and he said, I think some people had a heart attack, because really that's what it looks like. I mean, if you want to protect everything with zero RPO, meaning continuous data protection, sure, but it probably, and again, we'll talk about this maybe later, is it could double or triple or quadruple your cost to be able to protect it at that scale.
Yeah, that's 2x, right? That's the factor of 2x.
Yeah, exactly. So, and this happens a lot. This is a sticker shock. Even in moving to the cloud, there's a certain amount of sticker shock because until you understand the way your applications behave in the cloud, you can really never know how it's going to work out, especially if you're looking at protecting existing legacy apps on-prem and then moving them off-prem as a DRBC environment. And sometimes it's lift and shift, sometimes it's just a temporary situation. Some things can't be moved. And you're just going to have to run into that. Again, this is where you, as a technologist, have the ability to give input to your management to make them understand that, look, we need to have this because when it goes wrong, your business could be fundamentally affected or even destroyed. Yeah. And again, we started with some of the scary stuff, but again, you know best. You've been working in this business for a real long time. All of you, I believe, have years or decades of experience in IT and have seen problems, solutions come and go. So ultimately, it needs to be a dynamic process that's regularly reviewed and addressed as things change. What we're finding is that most companies are looking to leverage the hybrid cloud model. Because again, this comes down to the idea of, and I believe this firmly, that the cloud should be an extension of your infrastructure rather than a final destination. Now granted, there's some things that move into the cloud and are happy there, but for the most part, I think that part of the promise of the cloud was a dynamic environment that allows you to move things in and out as needed. For one thing, it doesn't require you to scale your infrastructure based on your peak production requirements. And in some businesses, like in my case when we was back in retail, you had to deal with the Christmas peak, which was insanity. I mean, it basically doubled or even tripled our production requirements back in the 90s when everything was hardwired. So today, you have the flexibility of being able to offload a lot of that production to a cloud environment just as needed and be able to bring it back. And we've changed, and we used to call that repatriation, as if it was something negative. But realistically, the cloud gives you the opportunity to be dynamic in that things go to the cloud, things come back to the cloud. So you need to think as a two-way street when you're talking about leveraging the cloud. Workload automation, and this is the real challenge, because automation, even though we've been doing this for 10, 15 years, most environments aren't really all that automated. If you look at how most, and this is a comparison now and in a couple of years. And realistically, people say, oh yeah, in 2 years we're going to be all automated. In reality, they've had 15 years to do it. So the odds of them actually hitting it in 2 is a little slim, but I'll give them the credit, is at least they're thinking in the right way. And automation can be easy and it can be hard, but I think it's really important in the context of DRBC. Purely because, again, the human factor, and you can't guarantee that people will be able to, or will remember to, or will be confident enough to make the decisions that some of these systems can do more quickly and can do based on a set of constraints that you can strictly control. Sometimes you might just need to put in a validation point. We see this, we think you should do this. Do you agree, yes or no? And something that kind of decision can be very, very quick. What kind of automation are you seeing in the industry in terms of making workloads more portable?
Well, from a portability standpoint, let me address that quickly, right? We represent a cloud that's based on VMware, so vSphere. So it is very easy for the workloads to move back and forth from a failover and a failback perspective, or even a hybridity perspective where we could keep it live, move it from one place and bring it back. I call that disaster avoidance, right? Where it stays live. When we start talking about the automation piece, the great piece is that we're in the past, it used to be a physical book, right? That we would have to
the run book.
Go through the run book, right? Luckily, software has evolved to the point where we can bake in automation and orchestration. So we've partnered with Zerto, who they're very famous for their continuous data protection and their capabilities around this. VMware obviously has capabilities built into Site Recovery Manager. There are a number of vendors that can help you achieve this, but they're only as good as the work that you put into them, right? So you have to take the time and build it out correctly. You have to map the dependencies in. You have to know your dependencies before you build it, really, right? So you have to do a true site assessment. You have to do some of the stuff you were talking about making sure in the mission critical layer, maybe I've got my identity services already running. So in my DR target, I better have Active Directory live. I better have my identity services, DNS, VPN.
Now, I've heard the term pilot light.
Exactly.
That's a great idea, because I always call them dependencies, but realistically it's a pilot light.
It's a pilot light,
It's the thing that you really need to have there to be able to actually continue doing business.
Exactly.
So automation is pivot, and this is something that's reflected too, because we're talking about a dramatic shift toward HCI. And the thing that we're finding out is that most customers really want this to be included as part of an HCI model, because they want simplicity. I mean, ultimately, all of these opportunities that we're given add complexity as part of it. And it's unfortunate, but really that's what it is. When you give people choice, that means that they have to make choices, and the more choices you give them, the more complex the environment gets. And that's why I think it's important for US technologists to look at the fact, and this is something I'm sure you've been thinking about all the time, is making it simple so that when it comes to disaster recovery and business continuity, there's policies in place, there's a certain amount of automation that will protect the most critical parts of it, and then there's a balance in terms of, being able to respond appropriately to the mini disasters versus the mega disasters, because literally some companies may never have a full disaster, but I almost guarantee you that every company is going to have outages in some way, shape, or form. And this is all about preventing potential damage to your environment and to your business position and your finances. So ultimately companies want, and more customers are looking for the simplicity of it to be embedded as part of the program. Does that always work correctly in terms of embedding it in your environment? Depends on a lot of other factors, but it's something that people are asking for. This is something I can't stress often enough, disaster recovery testing. Honestly, any plan that you have, you can't trust unless it's tested and tested regularly. And if you're in a business environment that requires it, that you need to have documentation, this is something I talk to about when you hear companies say, well, we do DRaaS, disaster recovery as a service. Okay, well, what do you do for testing automation? We do DRaaS. That's not good enough. You need to have a company that that is willing to engage enough with you and your business to understand what compliance issues that you may have and the complexities of being able to simplify testing without interrupting production or, just having a low impact on the entire IT environment. So that being said, these are some parting thoughts, and this is something that I've been looking at for a long, long time. And I think you need to evolve data protection. Again, backup was all we had. So backup is the first thought that people have. It needs to be more than backup because backup was really designed to deal with things on a bulk basis. You built massive backup sets, stuff got stuffed away in a location. I used to call it an oubliette. I love the word because an oubliette is a place where you put something that you want to know where it is, but you don't ever want to have to deal with it. And backup can't be that way anymore because we're talking about an environment where all of the data that you're storing and you're paying to store should be accessible to you for a number of reasons, whether it's governance, whether it's GDPR-like issues about personal. When GDPRs, they want you to be forgotten, that means that you have to forget everything that they have in your system, which may be 2, 3, 4 generations of backups out. And ultimately, you need to be able to prove that. And believe me, it's in the U.S., it's in the EU today, and I think that states like California are going to cause challenges in that same way. Update and test, because remember, your environment and the environment today is far more flexible. So you need to be able to make sure that as you're evolving your environment, you're also evolving your data protection and your DR model. And then build partnerships. And this is the one thing that's hard because, again, everybody's using the term DRaaS or DR as a service. I really believe that it requires a little bit more effort than that in terms of finding a partner who, one, is willing to sit down with you and provide insight. Because realistically, unless you've been through a real disaster, you don't know how to do these things. You can estimate, you can guess, but it's different when it's academic. When it's really in your face, that's when you really start learning about human nature. That's when you really start learning about where the holes in your system may actually be. And having a partner that helps you with that and has insight and input into that thing can be one of the best decisions that you make. So thank you very much for that, putting up with all this. And now here's an opportunity for you to wade in. Again, Mike and I would love to be able to address any questions you may have. We also have a bunch of seed questions that we could put in there too. So for that, I'm going to hand it off to Deb.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Steve. And I'll kick it off with a question. Otherwise, please feel free to come up to the mic or raise your hand and speak loudly. The first question I think you touched on a little bit when you talked about people having a requirement to have their non-critical workloads in less than an hour. So do you have any advice, either of you or both of you, for prioritizing applications for protection?
You take that one, Mike. You go first.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's my bread and butter as a solution architect. The first step is to, once we get past that budget question that I talked about, is say, okay, well, what are we protecting? And today, the old school site assessment looks more like an export from vCenter in a lot of cases, or other tools. So maybe RV tools, vRealize automation, vRealize operations. Need to know how many workloads protect, how big they are, what do they represent in terms of resources. So compute, RAM, storage, the elementary basics, right? And then we start socializing that, because a lot of times we don't even know everything that's in the data center. Once we have that and we can look at it, then we can begin to talk around the business and say, okay, what is most critical? And I suggest that you start with, if you're in a company that is large enough to have business units, and those workloads represent business units, daily bread and butter, talk to them and try and understand their applications, understand which ones they're using the most. Now, you might be able to see that from a utilization report out of something like vRealize operations or vRealize automation. But a lot of times what you're missing is the human factor and how do they use it? Most importantly, not how frequently is it used, but how is it used? What does it impact downstream? And so that can take weeks. Once we do that initial assessment, we kind of send them off on their way to talk to their business partners. and they'll come back. And a lot of times what it looks like is it's been color-coded. And strangely, people tend to adopt stoplight color coding. So mission critical is always red.
Then you got yellow and then you
green,
got green.
So we know which ones are going to burn us the most.
Yeah.
And it's very important that they go through this maybe once or twice, right? We do it and we look at the cost and then we go back to the business and do it again. But I see we've got a question out here. Give it a little 1-2, see if it's on. There it is. You're live.
To go on a little extension on that point, I work for in the legal industry in the law firm. I often struggle with everything needs to be covered.
Yeah.
Right. Logic, and they obviously don't have a budget for everything that needs to be covered. So I once was challenged with trying to provide a price on every system to try to quantify the cost of this system being covered versus this system being covered. And on a shared infrastructure, that becomes very cumbersome.
Wow.
Do you have any thoughts on?
The shared infrastructure piece would make it quite challenging, right?
Yeah,
What you're almost describing is a t-shirt size menu for each workload, right?
Yeah.
Going in and mapping against, and I'll name one of the big cloud providers as an example besides myself. You can pick any one of the acronyms, right? AWS, Azure. We could help you do that on a dedicated basis. We're not multi-tenant. It's worth pointing out that what we represent is single-tenant DR targets. And then begin to associate them. That's a lot of manual work for somebody to ask you to do that. I can see that looking like an ugly spreadsheet in Excel that, a lot of pivot tables.
I did realize and stuff like that, but I just, when you have a SAN that shares storage and, a virtual infrastructure, it becomes a daunting task with 500 VMs. And
Right.
No, I agree. And, a lot of times, if you find a partner, so I've done those projects, right? I can think very clearly about a school system that I supported in Georgia, that they brought us 400 virtual machines, and I had to have not 400 conversations, but I had about 3 months worth of conversations drilling into each one of those, and we did put them in buckets. And what I found was instead of going down to the individual line, I had to group them in terms of criticality. So here's 80. They had 80 Active Directory servers scattered around, because of all the schools. And just start putting them in buckets and go, here's what your AD costs. Here's what your databases cost, right? And of course, you associate a value with those as far as mission critical, business critical, non-critical. Legal firms, I've worked with a number of those, and it's the retention that gets you, right? The infinite retention on the documents and making sure they're resilient. Object storage is great for that, right? Highly, highly durable object storage. But that's my best advice is try to up-level them, right? Anytime somebody takes you down to that level of granularity, they're not being very nice.
And that's where I'm looking at the evolution of storage and DR as well, because again, data protection really was pretty primitive. And now we're looking at an environment where there's ramifications for not having control of your data. Data can be both a liability and asset. So say, for example, from a GDPR perspective, if you fail to delete somebody or make changes to your environment based on a request, the GDPR can hit you for 20 million euros or 4% of your annual gross. That's a top. So realistically, finally, there's teeth in this information protection. And it establishes a framework where more and more companies are starting to think about, hey, we need to do better identification of data, especially unstructured data, because I don't know about you guys, but I've been following this quite a while, and I see a lot more growth in terms of unstructured data as opposed to structured data. And managing that, I think, is a next big nightmare. This is something I'm going to be focusing on a lot over the next few years. And I've been an object storage fan because of it, because metadata is magic when it comes to being able to use it as a
looking
tool.
at products like Varonis and stuff like that, but that's a budget issue too.
Exactly, it all is, right? But again, before what things that used to be a nice to have are going to become a you better have, because ultimately, you got to wave a $20 million sword or 20 million euro sword over somebody's head, then they're suddenly going to start thinking in the right terms. So yeah, did we cover what you needed?
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you so much for your question.
Right here?
Yes, sir.
You don't have to if you want, just holler out there.
Okay.
So I just want to make a quick comment about the RTO. Actually, RTO, and you touched a lot of it, but how we decide, what we determine RTO is we could perform a business impact analysis.
Yeah.
And together, first we will determine the
Right.
maybe 8 or 9, whatever is important, legal, regulation, reputation, you mentioned that, and the revenue, or whatever. So you consider the categories are important and they give time. Then you do the survey of each department, so users of each application.
Yep.
How long you want it to be back, otherwise the impact will be too much. Like you can do a dollar amount of reputation is tangible and so those kind of things that we can come up with RTO. The quick comment I want to mention is there's actually a second concept, it's called RTC capability. That RTO is a requirement by the business people. But RTC is what the IT capability. They said, okay, I wanted my system, my everything to get back. My finance, SAP, Oracle Finance to come back in 15 minutes. Then we look at our existing company posture, we have the capability. When we don't, then we have to back. We address it. Then you guys come in and say, look, give these options, whatever, switch over, fail over, snapshot to replace TSM backup, TSM backup will take a long time. That kind of thing will come into play. So that's just a quick comment. Actually, two concepts. RTC, we call it RTC, and the other was RTO.
That's very interesting. It's the first time I've heard that, but it makes perfect sense.
I've heard references to RTC as well, and like I say, it's always dangerous to chase the new terminology in the industry. But I agree with you. That's an interesting point, and it's hard to drive some of these from a technologist perspective. Some of this really is easy for us to see, and we can see why we would slice it in a different way. But not all of your business stakeholders are going to be cognizant of some of these things. This is where they trust us to make decisions. So, sir, you have a question there too? We want to get to as many as possible.
There's actually two aspects to RTO. There's the technology side. It's how fast can you get it back technologically, like between the time you say start and restore, get it done, and the system back up again. And that's pretty much the same for every category of data, unless you use like critical data is on disk and not so critical is on tape. It changes that there. Then the other thing is the category of the data, because the recovery time is also how long from the time you say, I'm going to start restoring this, but it's lower priority versus this other data, and you will either you count it from the time you say, I want to start restoring versus the time that it actually starts restoring. So
Right.
when I look at RTO, I look at that too, because that ties in with RPO.
Right.
Yeah, it even ties in with automation, going back to your business impact analysis.
From IT standpoint, it's RTO. But I want to make another comment, actually, because all business company, I don't want to mention So, but when I first started as a BCP business company, I have a heavy IT background. And usually the IT people would say, oh, like RTO. I said, no, you don't give me RTO. You give me your RTC. The RTO is the other. But then they were happy with the, okay, we're going to do switch over. We have two data centers, we switch over. We said, wait, that's only one scenario, right? Because that's what recovery has many scenarios. Data corruption issue, we had that. And the site facility failures, like the earthquake, flood, maybe the bomb, whatever it is. So those are the facilities. So the data is still intact, but if you have replication, and then if you have data corruption of the user errors, that's what we need.
Right.
So that kind of thing will be replicated to the other side.
Right.
Switch over will be usage. So
Yeah.
right now, our customers, people were happy with just switch over. No, it's not that.
Right. And you're right. Data gravity starts to become a real big issue as you go along.
So RTO has one, RTC has many RTCs, depending on single scenario. Oh yeah, IT is we're happy with switch over, we're done. No, you're not done. And what if the data corruption happens? Oh, it takes a month. I actually did 3 days ago, I had a casual lunch with the VM guys. I said, look, what's your question? I knew the answer. He said, I want to hear from him. He said, we'll recover for a month, take a month.
Right.
Well, so that's the interesting piece, right? There's a statistic, we just talked about this in the booth, right? There's less than 50% of customers perform malware checks on their target site, and they don't have tools to necessarily get there. So this is a talk track we've been working with Zerto a lot, just to name check that partner. Their journaling capability, where it's continuous data protection, and they're doing second type increments. If you've got corruption at the VM level, you can roll back individually, right? You can take a VM and roll back to an instance. So we had a customer in the booth an hour ago that told us it took him 2 months to come back, right? And then he implemented a Zerto type solution that had this incremental journaling. and it becomes it's just rudimentary. It's simple.
And it always goes back to the application you're protecting and the complexities of, especially when it comes, because you can work with snapshots, you can work with, I'm trying to think of the term, forgive me. But again, dealing with databases is a completely different critter than it is dealing with anything else. So ultimately, there's a certain need to tie into whether you're utilizing the tools that are inherent within the platform itself, or you need to provide a new model for doing either a virtual quiesce or some way that you can capture that's independent of the platform, because a lot depends on where, at what point these things occur and how easy it is to get back together once you have, at least you can pull the application back up and start to restore the data. Looks like we have another question here, sir.
Hi there, I had a question on the testing slide that came up. You guys went kind of quick. I don't know if you can bring it up.
Sure.
That would be great. I think it was like 2 or 3 slides in. It's right
There you
here.
go.
So the time frame that you guys list, once, twice a year, more than twice a year, it seems to be very, much more frequent than we do. So we do an inventory assessment on the application, and we define what's called a class of service to it. So depending on where it falls in, mission critical, business critical, or whatever, that's how we define our testing schedule. Now,
Sure.
Even our most critical applications, I work in healthcare, so our membership applications, we do every 2 years. So it's fairly complex. We look at mainframes, and then that's where we have a lot of our data, and then we have our applications that kind of feed it. There's a lot of upstream and downstream dependencies on those. So how did you come up with these numbers? And is this just a survey? Or
This is based on a survey of actual. Okay. And to be perfectly honest with you, I think the guys that say they test a lot more regularly, from my personal experience, when they actually get down to it, we find that they don't test as often as they should. And partly because it's such an onerous task to try and pull all this together. Like you said, the complexity, especially with legacy applications, it makes things a nightmare to be able to do it without disrupting your production environment.
Right. We have to take our mainframe, like I said, so 4 times a year we're able to pull that off and get a snapshot and be able to run tests from that. So we don't test production data, but we test a snapshot to it. So just how complex, or when they say disaster recovery testing, that's a pretty wide grasp here.
Right,
What
that
does
could be
mean?
just a couple of VMs, right? So there's plenty of people that will call a partial test good.
Right.
It sounds like you're living to a fairly high standard.
Well, and even if we spin up a VM, right, then that means we're going to do a test, a mini test on that to make sure that it's able to work. So is that just, within these parameters, or is it something much more defined? And
honestly, there's no good answer to that, because again, this is something that really what you consider testing is a gray zone. And again, I agree with you, because like I say, I came from a mainframe background as well, and you just don't do things like you do here in terms of, hey, we're going to just spin this VM up over here and make sure that it runs right. So ultimately, I agree that what you do is you're doing what I would call platform level testing, which says we will test this in general, and if it continues to work in general, then it will work explicitly with the task that we want it to run on it, right? Because again, that way you don't have to go through an entire failover process and then bring it back. You're just testing the segments of it to make sure that the segments behave like they're supposed to over time.
Yes.
And that may be sufficient. Like you say, I mean, ultimately, no one really has the time to shut down their entire infrastructure and then bring it back up again. So the best you can hope for is testing to make sure that the key elements that you trust and you count on continue to work the way that you expect them to.
Right, and that's what we do for the most part. We're actually doing a complete failover as we speak.
Wow.
We're getting into this, we don't have a whole lot of applications, but we're actually going to a data center that's not been put into production, and we're failing over the entire data center, and we're seeing how that's going to work with actual production data. So it's pretty exciting for us. We've never really gone through that before. What I like to see, and I don't know if you guys have it, would be some sort of recommendation. What do you guys think we should be doing as a testing based on complexity?
Yeah.
And that'll be it for me, so I'll go sit down.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question.
Excellent questions, really.
It's highly individualized, right? So as soon as you start talking about those trigger words and understanding the vertical that you're in, I start thinking about consulting.
Yeah.
Right, it's all about the front end work and working through it. I wouldn't have an easy answer because it's as different as every single person in this room. right? Because the reality is there's somebody in this room that's maybe got less than 50 VMs or 20 VMs,
Right.
no mainframe dependencies. So it takes a long conversation with you and understanding what your business can tolerate.
That's why I speak in terms of a partnership when it comes to DRBC is
Yeah.
that, I mean, there's a million different permutations in this formula. And having a company that can look at it objectively, because like you say, we were talking before about how do you triage your applications to which is more important, which is not. Trusting people to do it. My first project in a true DR project and a planning was post 9/11, and that's where a lot of us had. All of a sudden, our bosses woke up to the fact that, holy cow, things beyond our control will happen, and we need to know what to do. And ultimately, their solution at that time was pretty piecemeal because, again, we had mainframes and everything running, and it wasn't easy to be able to incorporate some of these older, because some databases were 20 years old and they had just been patched and added onto and modified, and being able to pull that up out of the ocean of tapes that we dealt with every day. It was testing it in a simple and cohesive manner was virtually impossible. So ultimately, like I say, a lot of it has to do with being aware, and this is what we do as technologists again. We're the ones who understand the insanity of what it takes to make this happen. And this is where it comes down to the challenge of bringing across the importance of this to your management, right? Because, I mean, if we're in the IT industry, we're all a little paranoid of trusting anything too much. So ultimately, we bring a certain amount of concern and I'd say conservatism more than anything to some of these decisions. Simply say, oh, we're doing fine, or this system works, and we just never had a problem with that. This is where we as technologists have to bridge the gap between the business intelligence that our quote unquote clients or internal stakeholders are dealing with, and the cost and the technology that's available to do this. And this is another thing I expect from partnerships when they do this, is the ability to bring on new technology and recommend based on the availability of new products and new services and resources. It looks like we're running toward the end here. We got another question here up front, sir.
I came from a mobile telecommunication sector. So there are two aspects that are what I think that I need a solution from or recommendation from you all. So one is that a time-sensitive application. If you take the reload for the mobile, so it's time-sensitive. Mm-hmm. And other aspect is like massive data, big data and all that. So how are we going to host these in cloud-based? So what is the resolution for this? What is your recommendation on that?
To replicate time-sensitive data?
Yeah.
Right, so that's where you want to be looking for
time-sensitive.
There's a couple ways to approach it. You can go old school, and you can get within a synchronous distance and do array-based replication, right? He would love that. He's going to nod his head and go, that is the gold standard. It's also as pricey as gold.
Right.
Right, because 2 data centers circuits the whole bit, right?
I think the question is different.
Okay.
So the application is time sensitive, the response sensitive. So those sort of application, how I'm going to host it in a cloud?
How are you going to host a time-sensitive application in the cloud if it's sitting in DR? Cloud is DR in this case?
No. If you take the towers, mobile reloads applications and all that.
Yeah.
So you need to have the informations uploaded or given to the tower system, so that the host or application needs to be reside closer to the towers, the telecommunication towers.
Oh, I see.
Those sort of application, how we are going to host it in cloud. So we were talking about hybrid cloud in all perspective.
Right.
So how are we going to serve those sort of application? And the second application is that big data. We generate massive data per hour. So how are we going to push those data to the cloud? So what is the mechanism for that? What is the future roadmap for that? I hope that you understand my question.
I think I understand it. I would almost want to take some time and sit down one-on-one and really dig into it to make sure I'm not missing it all, because you've got a very, very specific use case.
Right.
When we start talking about proximity of data, because of the dependency for time sensitiveness, right? That's something I've spent a lot of time in my career on. It almost sounds like an edge technology. So in this scenario, is your antenna the edge, and then the cloud is central? Where's the data coming from? The mobile handset?
Yeah, mobile handset to the application.
Right. And then it's calling back to an application here.
And it goes to the tower to give the information to
Yeah, so it sounds like you need multiple instances all over the place to get them as close as possible to end users. You need, WAN acceleration in between if there's dependencies. You need, if possible, dynamic content acceleration coming off of a cloud provider. That's not something we do. That would be a CDN provider.
Right. And ultimately, this mirrors things that we've been hearing about in terms of IoT applications moving forward, right? Is that the IoT challenge is really a networking challenge more than it is a storage challenge or anything else. Problem is, how do you define the edge? Because they say, well, there's going to be things processed on the edge. There's going to be things processed in the middle. Ultimately, where is this data going to move is how it's going to move. It really comes down to that connectivity issue. Like you say, time sensitive, the ability to be able to work with a handset through all the processes. How do you make sure that that's properly accelerated? And again, you're going to see this in IoT in general too. So I think that there's a lot of parallel research going on that will impact a problem like yours as well. That being said, I think we're running out of time here.
We are.
I think so. Thank you for bringing some great questions. And if you haven't stopped by the OVH booth in the Solutions Exchange, we're the first booth and it's gigantic. You can't miss us. And we're giving away some really cool swag. So please stop by and feel free if you have additional questions to come up afterwards. So thank you for attending.
Hey, thanks for coming by, everybody. And fill it. We have questionnaires. There's a questionnaire afterwards.
Yeah, there is a survey. Of course, VMware would like to see you fill that out. We'll take a look at the results as well. So thank you for your time today.
Yeah, anything good comes to me, anything bad goes to Mike. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.